Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. Translated from the Norwegian by Charles Archer. Book 3. The Cross. Part 2. Debtors. Chapter 1. Kristin learned only in part what had happened between Erlend and Simon. Her husband told her and Bjorgulf what Simon had said of his journey to Differen, and that afterwards they had exchanged harsh words, and in the end had parted unfriends. "More I cannot tell you of this matter," he said. Erlend was a little pale, his face set and resolved. She had seen it thus some few times before, in the years she had been wedded to him, and she knew it was a sign that these were matters he would say no more on. She had never liked it when Erlend had met her questions with this look. God knew she craved not to be held for more than a simple woman. She had rather had to answer for nothing but her children and her housekeeping. But she had been driven to put her hand to so much that seemed to her fitter for a man to deal with, and Erlend, it was clear, had thought it fitting that he should let such things rest upon her shoulders. And thus it beseemed him ill to carry things so high and answer so curtly, when she sought to know the rights of doings of his own which touched the welfare of them all. She took this unfriendship between Erlend and Simon Dar hardly. Ramborg was her only sister, and when she thought on it that now Simon would come among them no more, she understood fully for the first time how fond she had come to be of this man, and how much of thanks she owed him. In the troublous lot that was hers, she had had a sure stay in his trusty friendship. And she knew now that all over the countryside the folk would have a new titbit of gossip, that yonder Jorengard people had broken with Simon of Formo too. Simon and Ramborg were liked and held in high esteem by every soul, and for the most part she herself, her husband, and her sons were looked on with distrust and misliking. She had known that for a long time. Now they would be quite without friends. Kristin felt as though she must sink into the ground with sorrow and shame the first Sunday when she came onto the church green and saw Simon standing there a little way off in a cluster of yeomen. He bowed his head in greeting to her and hers, but it was the first time he did not come forward to shake hands and chat with them. But Ramborg went up to her sister and took her hand. "'Tis ill, sister, that our husbands have fallen out, but I don't see that you and I need to fall out because of it." She raised herself upon her toes and kissed Kristin, so that the folk in the churchyard could see it. But Kristin knew not how it was. She seemed to feel within her that, nonetheless, Ramborg was not greatly grieved. Never had she brought herself to like Erlend. God knew whether she had not set her husband against him, knowingly or unknowingly. Yet thereafter Ramborg ever came and greeted her sister when they met at the church. Ulfild asked to know why her aunt didn't come south to them any more. Then she ran across to Erlend and clung about him and his eldest son. Anjerd, standing quietly by her stepmother's side, took Kristin by the hand and looked troubled. Simon and Erlend and his sons held aloof from each other most diligently. Kristin missed her sister's children sorely too. She had grown fond of the two young maids, and one day when Ramborg had brought her son to Mass, and Kristin after worship was kissing Andres, she fell a-weeping. This weak, sickly boy had grown so dear to her, and she could not but feel, now that she had no truly little children any more, 'twas in a way a comfort to her to care for this little sister's son at Formoe and spoil him when his parents brought him with them to Jorungard. From Gaut she heard somewhat more of the matter, for he told her the words that had fallen between Erland and Simon that night they met by Skinfeld Gudrun's cottage. The more she pondered these things, the more it seemed to her that Erland was the most at fault. She had been angry with Simon, so much he should have known of Erland as to know that he could not have thus basely played his brother false. How strange soever the things he might do through thoughtlessness or hot temper. And when he saw what he had brought to part, he bore himself often most like a shy stallion that has broken loose and goes wild with fright at what he drags behind him. But that Erland never could understand that sometimes other men must needs cross him, to guard their own welfare against the mischief he had such a rare gift for making. And that when he cared not what he said, or how he bore himself. She remembered those days when she herself was yet young and tender. Time after time she had felt as though he were trampling on her heart with his reckless doings. He had cut himself off from his own brother. Even before Gunnulf went into the cloister, he had drawn away from them, and she had known that Erland was to blame. So often he had given offence to his pious and worthy brother, though never had Gunnulf done Erland anything but good that she knew of. And now he had thrust Simon from him, and when she would have known what it was that had brought unfriendship between them and their only friend, he but put on a lofty air and answered that he might not tell her. To Narkvi he had said more, she saw this well. The mother was sore and uneasy in mind when she marked that Erland and their eldest son grew silent, or turned their talk to some other matter as soon as she came near them. And this happened quite often. Gaut and Lavrans and Munin held closer to their mother than Nicolaus had ever done, and she had always talked more with them than with him. Nevertheless, it always seemed to her that, of all her children, her firstborn stood in a way closest to her heart. And since she had come to dwell on Jorungard again, the memories of the time when she bore this son under her heart and of his birth had grown strangely living and near. For she was made aware in many ways that here in Sill folks had not forgotten the sin of her youth. 'Twas almost as though they accounted her responsible to have besmirched the honour of the whole countryside of her birth, when she, the daughter of the man all here looked up to as their head, had gone astray. They had not forgiven that, nor yet that she and Erland had added insult to his shame and sorrow, when they fooled him into giving away an erring maid, with the most stately bridal that had been held in man's memory here in the northern dale. Kristin could not tell if Erland knew that now folk were raking these old tales up again. But if he did know it, it was like he cared nothing for the matter. He accounted her countrymen of the dale nothing but Wadmel farmers and village hinds one and all, and he taught her sons to think the same thing. It seared her soul to know that these men and women, who had thought much of her and wished her so well in those days when they called her Lavrans Bjorgelson's winsome daughter and the Rose of the Dale, now held Erland Nicolausen and his wife in scorn and judged them harshly. She besought not these folk. She wept not for that she was become a stranger amongst them, but it hurt her sorely. And it seemed to her that even the headlong hillsides about the dale, that had sheltered and guarded her childhood, now looked down upon her and her home in other guise, with darkling menace and hard, stony grey will to cow her spirit. Once she had wept bitterly. Erland had known of it, and he had not long had patience with her then. When he learned that she had gone lonely through these many months with his child, a heavy weight beneath her sad, fearful heart, he had not taken her into his arms and comforted her with gentleness and loving words. Angered and shame-struck had he been when he saw that now it would come to light how unworthily he had dealt with Lavrans. But he had not thought how much worse it needs must be for her, the day when she should stand shamed before her proud and loving father. Nor had Erland greeted his son with overmuch joy when, at last, she had borne this child forth to life and the light. In that hour when she was delivered from her endless agony of soul and terror and torment, and saw the ugly shapeless burden of her sin take life under the priest's powerful prayers, and change to the loveliest child, whole and without blemish, in that moment it had seemed as though her heart melted with humble gladness, and that even the hot defiant blood of her body turned to white, sweet, innocent milk. "And with God's help he may grow human in time," said Erland, as she lay there in bed, and would have had him rejoice with her over this costly treasure, that she could scarce suffer from out of her arms long enough to let the women tend the child. Yet his children by Aline Ormsdatter he loved, that she had both seen and known. But when she bore Narkvi to his father and would have laid him in the man's arms, Erland had pulled a wry face and asked what he should do with this brat who leaked both top and bottom. For a long time Erland had looked askance at his eldest true-born son, and could not forget that Narkvi had come into the world at an untoward time, though yet the boy was so fair and winsome and likely a child that any father might well rejoice who saw such a son growing up to fill his place. And Narkvi had loved his father so that it was a marvel to see it, even from the time when he was a tiny babe. He had beamed like the sun over the whole of his little comely face if his father took him between his knees for a moment and said but 2 words to him, or if the man let him hold his hand crossing the courtyard. Staunchly had Narkvi striven to win his father's favour in those days, when Erland liked all his other children better than this one. Björgulf had been his father's favourite while the boys were small. Then would Erland sometimes take his little sons with him up to the knight's armoury when he had an errand thither. All the armour and weapons not in daily use at Huseby were kept there. While the father talked and jested with Björgulf, Narkvi would sit still as a mouse on a chest, panting for very joy that he had leave to be there. But as time went on, and by reason of his bad sight, Björgulf could not, so well as his brothers, go abroad with Erland, and as the boy himself grew more withdrawn and silent when with his father, all this was changed. 'Twas now well nigh as though Erland were a little shy of this son. Kristin wondered at times whether Björgulf blamed his father in his heart because he had wasted all their substance and had dragged down his son's fortune with him in his downfall, and whether Erland knew or guessed this. Howsoever it might be, it seemed as though Björgulf alone, of all Erland's sons, did not look up to him with blind love and unbounded pride in calling him father. One day the 2 smallest boys noticed that their father was reading the Psalter in the morning. They asked why he did this, for it was no fast day. Erland answered it was for his sins. Kristin knew that these days of fasting were a part of the penance laid upon Erland for his adultery with Sunniva Olafsdatter, and that the elder sons at least knew of this. Narkvi and Gart seemed to think nothing of it. But it chanced that she looked just then at Björgulf. The boy sat there blinking near-sightedly down into his meat bowl and smiling to himself. So had Kristin seen Gunnulf smile one time and another when Erland got on his high horse. The mother did not like the sight. Now it was Narkvi whom Erland would ever have by him, and the lad lived as though all the roots of his being were knit to his father. Narkvi served his father as a young page, his lord and chieftain. He would have none but himself care for his father's horse, and keep his riding gear and arms in good order. He buckled the spurs on Erlend's feet, and bore hat and cloak to him when he would go out. He filled his father's beaker, and carved for him at board, where he sat on the bench to the right of Erlend's seat. Erlend laughed a little at the lad's courtesy, but he liked it well, and more he made Narkvi all his own. Kristin saw that now he had quite forgot how she had striven and prayed to win from him a little fatherly love for this child. And Narkvi had forgotten the time when he was young and little, and it was to her he came to seek comfort for all ills and counsel in all his troubles. To his mother he had ever been a loving son, and this he was still in a fashion. But she felt that the older the boy grew, the farther he drifted from her and all her concerns. Of all she had upon her hands, Narkvi took no thought at all. He was never loath to do her will when she set him to any task, but he was strangely wooden-handed and clumsy at all that might be called farm work. He did it lifelessly and listlessly, and never could bring anything to an end. He was not unlike his dead half-brother, Orm Erlendsson, in many ways, his mother thought. He was like him in looks, too. But Narkvi was strong and sound, lusty in the dance and in all sports, a good marksman with the bow, and passably skilled, too, in the use of other weapons, a good rider, and a ski-runner of the best. Kristin spoke of this one day with Ulf Haldarsson, Narkvi's foster-father. Ulf said, "No one has lost more through Erlend's folly than this boy. Better stuff than Narkvi for a knight and a great noble will not be found in Norway these days." But his mother saw that Narkvi never thought of all he had lost by his father's fault. At this time there was again great unrest in Norway, and rumours flew northward over the parishes of the Dale, some likely enough and some wholly unbelievable. The great lords south and west in the realm and throughout the uplands were so miscontent with King Magnus's rule. 'Twas said they had openly threatened to take to arms, to rouse the commons, and bring Sir Magnus Eiriksson to govern after their will and counsel, or else take for king his mother's sister's son, the young John Haftalsson of Suderheim. His mother, the Lady Agnes, was daughter to King Hakon Harleg of blessed memory. Of John himself but little was heard, but it was said his brother Sigurd was the head and font of the whole enterprise, and Bjarn, Erling Vidkunsen's younger son, was of their counsels. Folk told how Sigurd had sworn, if John became king, he should take one of Bjarn's sisters for queen, for the maidens at Giske too were of the race of the old Norse kings. Sir Ivar Ogmundsson, who before had been King Magnus's stoutest stay, 'twas said had now gone over to the party of these young nobles, and many others of the land's richest and best-born men as well. Of Erling Vidkundsen himself and the Bishop of Bjorgvin, folk said that they were pushing from behind. Kristin hearkened but little to these rumours. Bitterly she thought they were but small folk now, the matters of the realm touched them not. Yet in the autumn gone by she had spoken somewhat of them with Simon Andresen, and she knew too that he had talked of them with Erlend. But she had seen that Simon was not happy to talk of these things, in part maybe because he didn't like it that his brothers should mix themselves in such perilous doings. And Gerd at least, she knew, was led by the nose, by his wife's kinsfolk. But he was fearful too that talk of such like things might discomfort Erlend, since he was born to sit among the men who met in council for Norway's realm, and now mischance had barred him out from the fellowship of his peers. But Kristin knew that Erlend spoke of these things with his sons. And one day she heard Narkvi say, "But should these lords make good their right against King Magnus? They could not be so base, father, for sure, as not to take up your cause, and force the king to mend the wrong he did you." Erlend laughed, but his son went on. "You first showed these lords the way, and brought to men's minds that it was not the wont of Norway's chiefs of old to sit still, and brook oppression by their kings. It cost you your Udal lands and fiefs. The men who had leagued them with you came off without a scratch. You alone paid for them all." "Ah, yes, then they have the better reason to forget me, I think," said Erland, laughing. "And Huseby hath the archbishopric got in pledge. I think the lords of the council will scarce pester King Magnus, poor moneyless wretch, to redeem it." "The king is your kinsman, and so is Sigurd Haftorson, and most of these men," answered Nakvi vehemently. "How, without shame, can they forsake that man of all Norway's nobles who bore his shield with honour to the northern marches, and purged Finland and the Ganvik coast of the king's foes and gods, caitiffs we would call them?" Erland whistled. "Son, one thing I can tell you. I don't know how the Haftorsons' enterprise will fare, but I wager my neck they will not dare show Magnus a naked Norse sword. Talk and bargaining I'm sure there will be, but not a bolt shot. And these gentry will never put on harness in my cause, for they know me, and they know well that I am not so squeamish at the sight of cold steel as some others might be." "Kinsmen, say you?" "Aye, they are your third cousins, both Magnus and the Haftorsons. I remember them from the time I served in King Hakon's court. 'Twas well for your kinswoman, the Lady Agnes, that she was daughter of the king, else had she belike been fain to go upon the wharves and gut fish, if some such lady as your mother had not hired her to help in the byre out of pious charity. More times than one have I wiped these Haftorsons' nose when they were to be brought before their mother's father, and they come running into the hall as snotty-nosed as they crept off their mother's lap. And if I caught them a buffet in cousinly kindness, to teach them somewhat of manners, they shrieked like stuck pigs. I hear it said these oafs of Suderheim have been made men of at last. But to look for a kinsman's help from that side? You might as well shear the sow for wool." Afterwards Kristin said to Erland, "Nakvi is so young, my husband. Do you think it is wise to talk so freely with him on such matters?" "And you are so mild of speech, my dear wife," said Erland, smiling, "that I see well you would take me to task. When I was of Nakvi's age, I fared north to Vargoy the first time. Had Lady Ingeborg been loyal and true to me," he burst out hotly, "then had I sent her Nakvi and Gout to serve her. Yonder in Denmark 'tis like there had been advancement for two mettlesome blades with warm blood in their veins." "I didn't think," said Kristin bitterly, "the time I bore you these children, that our sons should seek their bread in a foreign land." "You know that I didn't think so either," said Erland. "But man proposeth, and God disposeth." So Kristin said to herself, 'twas not alone that it hurt her heart to notice that Erland and her sons, now they were growing up, behaved as though their affairs were beyond a woman's kenning. She was afraid, too, of Erland's reckless tongue. Never did he call to mind that his sons were little more than children. This too there was, that, young as the sons were, Nikolaus was now 17 winters old, Bjorgolf would be 16, and Gout 15 at harvest time. These three already had a way with women that made their mother uneasy. True it was, nothing had befallen that she could point to. They did not run after womenfolk. They were never gross of tongue or foul-mouthed, and liked it little when the serving carles offered to crack ribald jests or bring lewd tales to the manor. But Erland too, in such matters, had ever borne him right seemly and modestly. She had seen him abashed at talk that made both her father and Simon laugh heartily, but at such times she had felt dimly that the others laughed as peasants laugh at tales of the devil's dull-wittedness, while learned men, who know better his wicked wiles, care little for such jesting. And Erland too might have claimed to be guiltless of the sin of running after women. Only folk who didn't know the man could think him loose, in the way of luring women to him and leading them astray of set purpose. She never denied to herself that Erland had had his will with her without use of love philters, without force or guile. And as for the 2 wedded women he had sinned with, she was sure that 'twas not Erland had been the tempter. But when light women met him halfway with bold and luring laughter, she had seen that he grew curious as a young kid. A drift of secret, heedless lightness would seem to breathe from the whole man. And with dread she thought she saw the Erlandsons were like their father in this. They ever forgot to think, before doing anything, of the judgment of other folk, though afterward they took to heart keenly what was said. And when women met them with smiles and oncoming, they didn't grow abashed or shy and sullen like most lads of their age. They smiled back, chatted, and bore them as easily and freely as had they been to the king's court and learned a courtier's ways. Kristin grew fearful lest they should be drawn into trouble through sheer simplicity. To their mother, rich housewives and their daughters, as well as poor serving women, seemed all too forthcoming in their bearing towards these fair youths. But they would grow hot with wrath, like other young men, if afterward anybody teased them about a woman. Frida Sturkarsdatter in especial did this often. She was a fool in grain, old as she was, not many years younger than the mistress herself, and she had had 2 bastard children. For the last she had even been hard put to it to find a father. But Kristin had held a shielding hand over the poor creature. Because she had fostered Björgulf and Skule with care and love, the mistress was long-suffering with the woman, though it vexed her that the old creature should be ever talking to the boys about young women. Kristin thought now it were best if she could get her sons wedded at a young age. But she knew it would not be easy. The men whose daughters might be equal matches for Nakvi and Björgulf in blood and birth would think that her sons were not rich enough. And the king's enmity and the judgment their father had brought down upon himself would stand in the way if the lads should try to better their lot in the service of great lords. With bitterness she thought of the times when Erland and Erling Vidkundsen had talked of a match between Nicolaus and one of the High Steward's daughters. She knew indeed of one growing maid and another amongst the Dales that would be a fitting match, rich and of good kindred, though their forebears for the space of some lives back had held themselves back from the service of the court and had stayed at home in their own country. But she could not brook the thought that she and Erland might get no for an answer if they made suit to these great landowners. Here Simon Dar might have been the best of spokesmen, and now Erland had bereft them of this helper. To the service of the church she thought none of her sons had a bent, unless it were Gaut or Lavrans. But Lavrans was still so young, and of all her sons Gaut was the only one whose help on the farm was of some use to her. Storm and snow had wrought havoc with the fences this year, and the snowfall in the days about spring Holy Cross Mass had hindered the work, so that the folk were hard driven to get through in time. Therefore one day Kristin sent off Nakvi and Björgulf to mend the fencing round a field that lay up nigh to the highway. In the afternoon their mother went up to see how it fared with the lads at this unfamiliar work. Björgulf was working on the farm road fence. She stopped a while and spoke with him. Then she went on northward. Soon she caught sight of Nakvi leaning over the fence, talking with a woman on horseback who had stopped at the road's edge, close by the paling. He fondled the horse. Then he caught the girl by the ankle, and presently he moved his hand a little upward, as though heedlessly. The young maid saw the lady first. She reddened and said something to Nakvi. He drew away his hand quickly and looked something dashed. The girl would have ridden on, but Kristin called out a greeting. Afterwards she spoke a little with the maid and asked after her kinswoman. The girl was sister's daughter to the mistress of Ulvoldsdene, and lately come a-visiting there. Kristin made as though she had seen nothing, and talked a little with Nakvi of the fencing, after the maid was gone. Not long after, it chanced that Kristin was at Ulvoldsdene for the space of 2 weeks. The woman there was in the straw, and after the child was born lay gravely sick. Kristin was there as her neighbour, and one who was thought the most skilled leech woman in the parish. In this time Nakvi came over often with messages and errands to his mother, and this girl, Eivor Håkonsdatter, always found time to meet and talk with him. Kristin didn't like this at all. She had no liking for the maid, nor could she see that Eivor was fair, as she heard most men thought. She was glad the day she learned that Eivor was gone home again to Ramsdal. Yet she didn't think that Nakvi had cared anything for Eivor. The more so when she heard Frida prattling of the daughter of the house at Lopsgard, Asta Audundsdatter, and teasing Nakvi about her. Kristin was in the brewhouse one day, boiling a juniper brew, and she heard Frida's tongue busy again with this. Nakvi was with Gaut and his father outside in the back courtyard. They were at work on a boat they meant to have for fishing on the lake up in the fells. Erland was a skilful boat builder. Nakvi grew angry, but now Gaut joined in the teasing. Asta would be a fitting match, he said. Ask for her yourself if you think so, said his brother hotly. Nay, I will have none of her, answered Gaut. For I have heard that red hair and fir woods thrive on barren ground. But I know well you have a leaning to red hair. But that doesn't hold for women, my son, said Erland, laughing. Red-haired wives are wont to be white and soft of flesh. Frida laughed noisily, but Kristin grew angry. This seemed to her unseemly talk before such young boys. She remembered too that Sunniva Olafsdatter had had red hair, though her friends had called it golden. Then Gaut said, Be glad that I didn't say anything. I wouldn't, for fear of sin. But on Whitsunday watch night you sat with Asta in the tithe barn all the time we danced on the church green. So sure it is you must like her. Nakvi would have flown at his brother, but just then Kristin came out. When Gaut was gone, the mother asked her other son, What was this that Gaut said of you and Asta Audundsdatter? I think, mother, that nothing was said that you did not hear, answered the boy. He reddened and frowned angrily. Kristin said, "'Tis an ill thing that you young folks cannot keep a watch night, but you must dance and frolic about between the services. That didn't happen when I was a maid." "You have said yourself, mother, that when you were young, my grandfather would often sing for them when folk danced upon the church green." "Ay, but they were not such songs, and 'twas not such wild dancing," said his mother. "And we young folks kept us in seemly wise, each by our parents. We didn't go off in pairs to sit in barns." Nakvi seemed ready to make an angry answer, when Kristin chanced to look over at Erland. He was smiling stealthily, while he looked with one eye along the plank he was trimming with his axe. Angry and grieved, she went back into the brewhouse again. But she thought much on what she had heard. Asta Audundsdatter was none so bad a match. There was wealth at Lopsgard, and 3 daughters only, but no son, and Ingeborg, Asta's mother, came of most worthy kindred. That they at Jorungard should some day call Audun Thorbergsson kinsman by marriage, she had never thought. But he had had a stroke in the winter, and folk didn't think that he would live long. And the girl was well-mannered and winsome in her ways, and notable in the house by what Kristin had heard. If Nakvi truly liked the maid, it were not wise to set oneself against this match. They must wait 2 years yet with the wedding, so young as both Asta and Nakvi were. But she would gladly make Asta welcome then as her son's wife. But one fair day in the middle of the summer, Cyrus Solomond's sister came in to Kristin to borrow something. The women were standing outside before the storehouses saying farewell, when the priest's sister said, "Have you heard about Ivor Harkensdatter? Her father has driven her from his house, for she was with child. So now she has come back for shelter to Ulfvaldsdene." Nakvi had been an errand up in the storehouse loft. He stopped short on the lowest step. When his mother caught sight of his face, such a sickness came on her, she felt as though her legs would scarce bear her up. The boy was red to the roots of his hair as he went past towards the dwelling house. But Kristin soon saw from the others' gossip that things must have been so with Ivor long ere she first came to the parish that spring. "My poor harmless boy," thought Kristin with a lightened sigh. "He is shamed now because he had thought well of the girl." A few nights later Kristin lay in her bed alone, for Erland was gone from home fishing. She thought that both Nakvi and Gaut were with him, but she was waked by Nakvi's touching her and whispering that he must speak with her. He crept up and sat down on the bed by the footboard. "Mother, I have been over and spoken with that poor woman, Ivor, tonight. I knew that they lied about her. I was so sure I had gladly taken a red-hot iron in my hand to prove she lied. Yonder magpie from Romangard." His mother lay still and waited. Nakvi strove to speak steadily, but all the time his voice kept shifting up and down with the hurry of his spirits. She was on her way to Matins the day after Yule. She went alone, and the road from their farm lies a long way through forest. There she met 2 men. It was dark. She doesn't know who they were. Maybe outlawed robbers from the fells. At last she could keep them off no longer. Poor weak young thing. She couldn't tell anyone. When her mother and father saw her mischance, they dragged her by the hair and threw her out of home with blows and curses. She wept so, mother, when she told me all this. It would have melted the very stones in the hillsides." Nakvi stopped speaking suddenly and drew a long breath. Kristin spoke of how it seemed to her a sore mischance that these villains had escaped. She hoped that God's justice would overtake them and bring them to their due reward on the gallows tree. Then Nakvi began to talk of Ivor's father, how rich he was, and kin to one worthy family and another. The child Ivor would send away to be fostered in another parish. Goodman Dar's wife had had a bastard by a priest, and there sat Sigrid Undset at Crook, a good and honoured woman. A man had to be both hard of heart and unjust to think Ivor an outcast, for, against her will, it had been her lot to suffer shameful mischance. She might well be fit, none the less, to be wife to a man that held honour dear. Kristin pitied the girl and cursed the ravishers, and in her heart thanked and praised fortune that not for 3 years yet would Nakvi be of age. Gently she urged him to think that now he must walk most heedfully, not to seek Ivor in her bower late of an evening, as he had done this night, nor show himself at Ulfvaldsdene save when he had an errand to the folk of the house, else he might, all unwittingly, bring it about that folk should spread abroad yet uglier gossip of the luckless young child. Yes, it was well enough to say that they who doubted Ivar's word and didn't believe she had come to harm blamelessly would find him no weakling. Nevertheless, it would be an evil thing for the poor girl if there was more talk. 3 weeks later, Ivor's father came and fetched his daughter home to her betrothal and wedding. It was a good farmer's son of her own parish that was the man. At first the parents on both sides had been against the match, because they were at odds about some farmlands. In the last winter the men had made friends again, and the two young folk were to have been betrothed, but then suddenly Ivor would not. She had set her fancy on another man. But afterwards she saw it might well be too late to throw away her first lover. Nonetheless she went to be with her mother's sister in Sill, thinking belike that here she would find help to hide her trouble, for now she was set upon having this new man. But when Hilleborg at Ulvaldine saw how it was with the girl, she sent her back to her parents. That her father had flown in a fury and had beaten his daughter once and again, and that she had fled hither once more, was true enough. But now had he come to an accord with the first suitor, and now Ivor must put up with him, little as she might like it. Kristin saw that Narkvi took this badly. For many days he went about, scarce speaking a word, and his mother had such pity of him, she scarce dared to look his way. For if he met his mother's eye, he turned so red and looked so abashed that it cut Kristin to the heart. When the serving folk at Jorengard would have gossiped of these doings, the mistress bade them sharply to hold their tongues. She would not have that dirty matter or that wretched woman named in her house. Frida marvelled greatly. Had she not many and many a time heard Kristin Lavransdatter judge mildly and help with bounteous hands a maid who had fallen into such mischance? Frida herself had twice found safe shelter in her mistress's pity. But in the little she said of Ivor Håkonsdatter, she spoke as ill of her as any woman can of another. Erland laughed when Kristin told him how sadly Narkvi had been fooled. It was one evening when she sat out on the green spinning, and her husband came and stretched himself on the grass at her side. "Well, no great harm has been done, I think," said the father. "Rather it seems to me that the boy has learned a man's lesson at a cheap rate. Don't put your trust in women." "Is that what you say?" asked his wife. Her voice shook with smothered anger. "Yes," Erland smiled. "You see, of you, I believed the time I met you first. You were so gentle a maid you could scarce find in your heart to bite a slice of cheese, yielding as a silk ribbon and mild as any dove. But therein you fooled me finely, Kristin." "How do you think it would have gone with all of us," she said, "had I been so soft and gentle?" Erland took her hands, so that she had to stop her work. He smiled up at her, shining with gladness. Then he laid his head in her lap. "No, I didn't know, my sweet one. How good was the luck God gave me when he led you into my path, Kristin." But because she must ever and at all times keep herself in check, to hide her despair at Erland's eternal heedlessness, it would chance at times that her temper took the upper hand when she must correct her sons. She grew heavy of hand and hot of speech, and 'twas oftenest Ivar and Skule that bore the brunt. They were at the worst age now, in their 13th year, and so wild and self-willed that Kristin, at her wit's end, thought many a time, was there any mother in Norway who had the rearing of two such ruffians? Comely they were, like all her children, with black, silky, soft, ringleted hair, blue eyes beneath black brows, and narrow, fine-cut faces. They were tall for their age beyond the common, but narrow-shouldered still, with long, lean limbs. Their joints stood out like the knots of a cornstalk. They were so alike that no one outside their home knew them one from the other, and throughout the parish folk named them the Jorengard Swords, and it was not meant as a title of honour. Simon had first given them this nickname in jest, because Erland had made each of them the gift of Dirk, and these small swords they never put down, except when they were in church. Kristin liked it little that they had got the daggers, and yet less that they ever went about with axes, spears, or bows. She feared that these hot-headed boys might bring some mischief on themselves with such things. But Erland said curtly, they were so old now it was time they got used to bearing arms. She lived in one unending terror for these, her twin sons. When she didn't know where they were, the mother wrung her hands in secret and besought Mary Virgin and St. Olaf to lead them home again, alive and unscathed. They climbed the fell sides through rifts and up the face of headlong cliffs where no one had been before. They robbed eagles' nests and came home with ugly, yellow-eyed, hissing fledglings within the bosoms of their coats. They scrambled among the slate rocks along the Lagan, northward in the gorge, where the river dashes from fall to fall. Once Ivar had been dragged by his stirrup and half killed. He had been trying to ride a half-broken young stallion that the boys had got a saddle on, God only knows how. With nothing to do, they had ventured into the Finn's hut at the Tolstad woods. From their father they had learned some words of the Lap's tongue, and when they greeted the old Finn witch-wife with these, she had feasted them on meat and drink, and they had stuffed them full to bursting, and that on a fasting day. And Kristin had ever held so strictly to it that when the grown folk fasted, the children must content them with little food, and such like things as they had no mind to. For to this she had been used by her parents when she was little. This time, for once, Erland too was stern with his sons, took and burnt the sweet meats the Finn wife had given them to take, whilst he strictly bade them ever to go again, even to the edge of the forest where the Finns were. But none the less it tickled him to hear of the boy's adventure, and after he would often tell Ivar and Skule tales of his doings and travels in the north, and of what he had seen there of these folks' ways, and he talked to the boys in this ugly heathenish speech of theirs. For the rest, Erland scarce ever chid his children, and turned it aside in jest when Kristin bewailed the twins' ways. At home on the manor they did endless mischief, though they could be useful too, when they must. Unhandy like Narkvi they were not. But time and again, when their mother had set them some work and came to see how it fared, the tools would be lying there, and the boys standing watching their father, while he showed them how seamen made knots and such like. Lavrans Bjorgulfsson had often been wont, when he made a cross with tar over the byre door, or on such like places, to paint a little with the brush round about, paint a ring outside, or draw a stroke over each cross-arm. One day the twins bethought themselves to make a target of one of these old cross-marks. Kristin was beside herself with despair and wrath at such Jewish doings, but Erland took the children's part. They were so young, one could not look that they should think on the holiness of the cross each time they saw it tarred over a byre door, or on a cow's back. Let the boys go up to the cross on the church green, kneel before it and kiss it, and say 5 paternosters and 15 aves. No need to drag Cyrus Solomon to the manor for this. But this time Bjorgulf and Narkvi stood by their mother. The priest was fetched, and he sprinkled holy water on the wall, and corrected the 2 young sinners most sternly. They gave Kristin's bulls and he-goats the heads of snakes to eat, to send them horn-mad. They teased Munin because he clung still to his mother's skirts, and Gout too. He was the one they were most oftenest at odds with. For the most part the Erlandssons held together in the goodliest brotherhood. But now and again, when they got past bearing, Gout would give them a drubbing. To chide them in words was like talking to a wall, and if their mother grew hot with them, they would stand, their bodies stiff, their fists clenched, scowling at her with glittering eyes from under wrinkled brows, red as fire with fury. Kristin thought on what Gunnulf had told of Erland, that he had cast his knife at his father, and lifted his hands against him more times than one while he was yet a child. So she thrashed the twins, and thrashed hard, for she thought with terror, what would become of these children of hers if they were not tamed betimes, and soon? Simon Dar was the only one who could do anything with these 2 madcaps. They loved their uncle, and always grew meek and biddable when he talked to them good-humouredly and quietly. But now that they saw him no more, their mother could not see that they missed him. Sadly, Kristin thought, the heart of a child is fickle. And secretly in her heart, the mother knew that, in spite of everything, it was of these two sons she was well nigh proudest. Could she but break this ill-omened defiance and wildness, it seemed to her none of the brothers promised a fairer manhood than these two. They had good health and were strong and sound of body, were fearless, truthful, generous, kindly to all poor folk, and more times than one they had shown a readiness and swiftness in counsel that far outwent, she thought, what one could look for from such young lads. One evening in the hay harvest, Kristin had been kept late in the kitchen house when Munin came rushing in, shouting that the old goat shed was on fire. There were no men at home or nearby. Some were at the smithy hammering their scythes sharp. Some had gone north to the bridge, where the young folk were wont to gather on summer evenings. The mistress caught up a pair of buckets and ran, calling to her serving women to follow after. The goat shed was a little old house with a roof going right down to the ground, and stood in a narrow way between the courtyard and the farmyard, beside the middle of the main stable wall, and with other houses built close to it on either side. Kristin ran into the hearth-room penthouse and caught up a broad axe and a fire-hook. But when she came round the corner of the stable, she saw no fire, but only a thick cloud of smoke pouring forth from a hole in the goat-shed roof. Ivar sat up on the roof ridge, hacking down at the roof. Skule and Lavrans were inside the house, tearing down burning flakes from the roofing and trampling and stamping out the fire. Now Erland came running, and Ulf and the men who had been at the smithy. Munin had run on thither and given warning. And now the fire was soon put out. But the worst mischance might well have befallen. The evening was still and sultry, but with a puff of wind from south ever and anon, had the fire once been let blaze up in the goat shed, most like all the houses round about the north end of the yard, the stables, the storehouses, and the dwelling houses themselves had been swept away. Ivar and Skule had been up on the stable roof. They had trapped a hawk, and had gone up to hang it from the gable cross, when they smelt burning, and saw smoke coming from the roof below them. Straight away they leaped down on the roof, and with the small axes they had in their hands, began to hack away the smouldering turf, while they sent Lavrans and Munin, who were playing nearby, the one for hooks and the other to their mother. By good fortune the laths and rafters of the roof were too rotten to burn freely. But it was clear this time the twins had saved their mother's manor by setting to work straight away to tear down the burning roof, and wasting no time in running first for grown folks' help. It was not easy to understand how the fire had started, if it were not in this way. That Gout, an hour before, had passed by with embers for the smithy, and he admitted that the fire-pan had not been covered, so perhaps a spark had flown on to the tinder-dry turf roof. But of that less was said than of the twins and Lavran's readiness, at the fire-watch that Ulf set, and wherein the whole household kept him company late into the night, while Kristin had strong ale and mead borne out to them. All three boys had burns on hands and feet. Their footgear was so scorched it broke in bits. Young Lavrans was but 9 years old, so it was hard for him to bear the pain with patience for long. But at first he was the proudest of all, going about with bound-up hands and hearing all the manor folk praise him. That night, when they had gone to rest, Erland pressed his wife into him. "Kristin mine, be not so careful and troubled about your children. Don't you see, dear one, what metal our sons are made of? You bear yourself towards them as though you looked that their path must lie between the gallows and the block. Methinks now you should joy in your reward for all you have borne, of pangs and pains and toils. In those years you went ever with a child beneath your belt, and a child at your breast, and a child on your arm. You would speak of nothing but the little bratlings, and now, when they have grown to wit and manhood, you go amongst them as though you were both deaf and dumb, scarce paying heed enough to answer if they speak to you. God help me, it would seem as though you loved them less, now you don't have the cares of their childhood to plague you, and our fair, well-grown sons are joy and a blessing to you. Kristin did not trust herself to answer a word, but she lay there and could not fall asleep. And towards morning she climbed over the sleeping man quietly, went on bare feet over to the peephole and opened it. The sky was cloudy grey and the air cool. Far to the south, where the hills drew together and closed the dale, a rain shower was sweeping over the uplands. The mistress stood a while looking out. It was ever hot and close here in the new storehouse loft, where they slept in summer. On the breath of dampness that was in the air, the scent of hay was borne into her, so strong and sweet. A bird here and there out in the summer night twittered a little in its sleep. Kristin found her fire steel and lit a stump of candle. She crept over to where Ivar and Skule slept on their bench bed, let the light shine upon them, and felt their cheeks with the back of her hand. Sure enough, they had a little fever. Softly she said an Ave Maria and made the sign of the cross over the two. Gallows and block! That Erland could make a jest of such things. He himself, who had been so near. Lavrans moaned and murmured in his sleep. The mother stood a little, bent over the two youngest, who had their couch on a small bench cot behind the footboard of their parents' bed. Lavrans was hot and flushed and tossed about, but did not wake when she touched him. Gout lay with his milk-white arms behind his neck, in among his long, flaxen yellow hair. The bedclothes he had thrown clean off him. Such hot blood did he have that he would ever sleep naked, and he was shining white of skin. The sunburnt hue on face, neck and hands stood out sharply. His mother drew the covering up above his waist. It was hard for her to be vexed at Gout. He was so like her father. She had said but little to him of the mischance he so nearly had brought upon them all. So clear-headed and thoughtful was this boy, she thought full surely he would take it to heart of his own accord, and not forget it. Nakvi and Björgulf had the second of the two beds in the loft. For a long time the mother stood and let the light shine upon the two sleeping youths. Black down already shadowed their childishly soft red mouths. Nakvi's foot stuck out from under the coverlid. Narrow, high of instep, deep arched in the sole, and not very clean. And yet it seemed to the mother it was not long since this man's foot was so little it was quite hidden in her closed hand, and she had pressed it in under her breast and lifted it to her mouth, gently biting each single little round toe bud, for they were as pink and sweet as the flower bells on a bilberry bush. It might well be that she was not thankful enough for the portion and the lot God had granted her. The memory of the time before Nakvi was born, and of the visions of horror she had writhed under, might shoot at times hot as fire through her mind. She had been delivered, as when one wakes from dream horrors and the crushing weight of nightmare to the blessed light of day. But other women had wakened to find the day's misery worse than the worst they had ever dreamed. Even now, when she saw a cripple or a misshapen creature, Kristin would grow heart-sick with the memory of her own fear for her unborn child. Then would she humble herself with burning ardour before God and holy Olaf. She would throw herself into good works. She would strive to wring tears of true repentance from her eyes while she prayed. Yet always did she feel within her heart this unyielding discontent, and the warm glow faded, and the tears of penitence sank back into her soul as water oozes away in sand. Then she comforted herself. It was that she didn't have the gift of holiness she had one time hoped was her heritage from her father. She was hard and sinful, but like enough she was no worse than most folk, and like most folk she must lay her account with suffering in her second home, the fervent fires that were necessary to melt and cleanse her heart. Yet sometimes she longed to be another. When she looked upon the 7 fair sons who sat at her board, when on Mass day morning she walked up towards the church while the bells rang out and called so sweetly to gladness and God's peace, and saw the flock of tall, well-clad young lads, her sons, go up the slope in front of her. She knew of no other woman who had borne so many children and never had to know what it was to lose one, and all were fair and healthy, without blemish in body or mind. Björgulf alone was something near-sighted. She longed to be able to forget her cares altogether, to grow gentle and thankful, to love God and fear him as her father had done. She remembered her father had said that he who with contrite heart remembers his sins and bows before the Lord's cross never need bend his neck beneath this world's mischance or wrong. Kristin blew out the light, snuffed the wick, and put the stump in its place up under the topmost wall log. She went to the peephole again. Already it was light as day without, but grey and dead. Upon the lower house roofs that she looked over, the scant, sunburnt grass shook gently in a breath of wind. A little whispering sound ran through the leaves of the birch trees that showed over against her above the hall house roof. She looked at her hands, clasping the peephole frame. They were rough and toil-worn. Her arms right up to the elbows were brown, and the muscles swollen, hard as wood. While she was still young, the children had sucked blood and milk from her till all trace of a maiden's smooth, fresh roundness had been worn from her body. Now each day's toil took away something of what was left of the comeliness that had marked her out as daughter and wife and mother of men of noble blood. The narrow white hands, the soft fair-skinned arms, the clear and tender hue of face that she had shielded from the sun so heedfully with a kerchief and tended with cunningly brewed washes. For a long time since she had grown careless whether the sun beat straight upon her sweat-stained face and burnt it brown as any poor peasant wife's. Her hair was all that was left to her of her maiden beauty. It was thick and brown as ever. Seldom, though, she found time to wash and tend it. The heavy tangled plait that hung down her back had not been undone for 3 days. Kristin flung it forward over her shoulder, unplaited the hair and shook it out. It still wrapped about her like a cloak and reached below her knee. She took a comb from out of her case, and shivering a little now and again as she sat there in her bare shift beneath the little window that stood open to the morning chill, she combed out the tangled tresses heedfully. When she had smoothed her hair and plaited it again in a firm and heavy rope, it was as though she felt a little better. Then she lifted Munin, sound asleep, carefully in her arms, laid him down next the wall in the great bed, and herself slipped between him and the sleeping man. She took her youngest into her arms, laid his head to rest against her shoulder, and then fell asleep. She overslept next morning. When she awoke, Erland and the lads were up. "I think verily you suck your mother still, when no one sees," said Erland, when he saw that Munin lay by his mother. Angered at this, the boy ran out and crept over the headpiece of one of the beams which bore the balcony. He would sure show his manhood. "Jump!" shouted Nakvi from the courtyard below. He caught his little brother in his arms, turned him upside down and flung him to Björgulf. His 2 grown brothers tumbled him about till he laughed and screamed. But next day, when Munin stood weeping because a bowstring had caught his fingers in its rebound, the twins took and wrapped him in the coverlid, bore him up thus to his mother's bed, and stuffed into his mouth a lump of bread so huge the boy was well nigh choked.